Good morning and welcome to today's session on influencing a sustainable supply chain, part of the Low Carbon Lincolnshire program. My name is David Knight. I'm the principal consultant at PECT, and we're working on behalf of Business Lincolnshire to deliver these workshops. I've been involved in carbon accounting for several years now and work with a range of organisations, mostly focused on environmental management, but my specialism is the carbon elements of that process, and more specifically recently, the focus on net zero. At PECT, our aim is to protect and enhance the environment to leave a legacy for future generations. And we're always working towards helping organizations to develop good understanding of the current trends and challenges in the field of sustainability and low carbon, as well as practical ways to implement them. Under the Low Carbon Lincolnshire programme, we're delivering a series of fully funded bespoke workshops and supporting materials. These initial sessions are introductory webinars, which are high level, going over the basics, so not into much detail. It's just to cover what you can do to start the process and highlight whether this topic is something you need or wish to explore further. This is the fourth of series 4. This is the last webinar that we're doing today. The other introductory webinars are available online to watch as recordings. From these introductory webinars, if you do identify anything you wish to explore further, our main focus are in-person and virtual workshops. These will provide an opportunity for you to work through the requirements and ask questions directly related to your needs. An onboarding process will enable us to confirm your business's eligibility, but if you're joining us on the webinar today, then you are already eligible and can attend any of the sessions. One thing we're also saying to help us ensure that the workshops can be tailored to meet your needs, please complete our survey to help us understand which topics you would find most useful. We've broken them down into 4 main topics. First one being net zero, which is the overarching need for all of this, and that includes the need for planning, targets, and organizational leadership. We then have a session on decarbonisation, where we'll explore the carbon element of net zero further, how to look at completing a carbon footprint, how to start a decarbonisation plan, and add projects to that plan. Those will be done in person, 1-day workshops split over 2 days, with net zero in the first half and decarbonisation in the second. Our virtual workshops are set for organisations who may wish to isolate specific elements of their net zero process, and there we're looking specifically at energy management, which is the supportive element to decarbonisation, how to develop an energy management system, identify energy efficiency opportunities, etc. The last is supply chains, which is the topic we're talking about today. And arguably, this is the most complex part of net zero, where we'll explore the value chain and its requirements. And this is really aimed at organizations who are at the point of addressing this wider element. Again, that's what we're looking to cover today. It's high level, just glancing over the complexity, the need for supplier engagement, including strategy and procurement, and considerations you need to make when starting this process. I have tried to keep it as simple as possible, but again, if you hear something today that piques your interest, then the workshop is where we'll go into detail. So please sign up today. As always, if you have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A, and we'll look to answer any questions at the end of today's session. Okay, so the net zero agenda, as per all my sessions, this is ultimately the driver of why we're here today. Net zero is essentially the management of carbon emissions throughout your organization, but importantly, and what today's session will tackle, is managing carbon emissions throughout your value chain. To achieve net zero, we need to reduce emissions not only for ourselves in terms of our scope 1 and 2, but also in terms of our value chain, which is arguably scope 3, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is today. The UK set government targets to achieve net zero by 2050, and this has been a real driver for most large organizations to encourage their suppliers to commit to a net zero target and to start to reduce their emissions as well. As I've said before, this is by far the most complex part of the net zero transition, and something organizations have never had to do before, certainly not at the scale required under net zero reporting. To make this even more complicated, there isn't also yet any standardized approach. So organizations are just following guidance to start to approach this topic. Now, as a result of that, there are a myriad of free resources, guides, toolkits, and self-help platforms that can support an organization starting this process. And what we want to do today is to look at the technical complexity to, to sort of introduce you to it and help you understand it in order to support you getting started. The slide here is a whole range of different websites you can go to with guides, toolkits, and general information to help you get started in this particular problem. The key thing is this is something that organizations are all grappling with. And like I say, without a set standard, it is really sort of a trial and error with lots of organizations. So the key thing is with any sort of supply chain is to get started, but just to be aware that it is still learning for most organizations at this time. So basically, on the back of that, I do just want to take this opportunity to be really plain and somewhat blunt about this. Supply chain engagement is the largest element in most organizations' carbon footprints, and therefore the most complex. It's really just to be honest with everybody and say this is not going to be an easy process, and not so much the complexity, but more the time it's going to take. There are no silver bullets. Even your suppliers may need a different strategy for engagement depending on where they are within their carbon journey. And I'm certain a lot of you on here today or watching this video are suppliers yourselves. So actually having an understanding of what you need from your suppliers will help you to have an understanding of what your clients are likely to need from you. I was actually attended a webinar the other day, and one of the point that was made is, I guess we just have to grapple with the concept that net zero is happening. No matter what we do, it is happening. It's going, it's there, it's going to happen. And it's only going to get quicker in terms of the requirements from organizations. The comment they basically made is that we can't sit back anymore. Essentially, we just have to get on with and do it, or else we're just going to be left behind. Now, we're already seeing movement from large organizations pushing for all levels of carbon accounting throughout their supplies, and particularly the largest contracts, which is the public sector, is demanding that any supplier within its supply chain above a tender value of 5 million at the moment must include not only their scope 1 and 2, but also their scope 3, and have developed a carbon reduction plan. And we're just going to see this to continue as regulation legislation sort of follows behind the net zero process. Now, I fully appreciate the complexity, but it is vital that all organizations start this process, as it's better to have beginning of something than essentially nothing and having to start from a position behind your competitors. Similarly, even suppliers now really find the financial benefits of having a carbon reduction plan. There is really a need now to consider the financial benefits of having a carbon reduction plan of sorts, including small organizations. So yeah, I guess I really wanted to say is that this isn't going to be an easy process, but it is something that we all have to grapple with at some point, and it's better to start sooner to put yourself in a better position for when regulation changes, so you're not left behind and actually you're ahead of the game in many aspects to it. So I just wanted to make that point, but let's look at the information and what we need to do when we start to look at our supply chains. So if you look into the previous webinars that we did, particularly the first one and the second one, which is net zero and decarbonisation, we spoke about scopes. So this is essentially what we're talking about, essentially what part of the carbon emissions you are responsible for. So as we're talking value chain, what we are talking about within this is your indirect responsibility. So this is where you don't own or control the sources of the emissions, but you are indirectly influencing how those emissions are being created. And that's the key thing to all of this. Your scope 3 is a measure of your influence. So scope 1 and 2, which is essentially your own carbon emissions that you are responsible for reporting and managing. Scope 3 is really just what you're able to influence, and that's in terms of the customers that you're working with or the suppliers that you're buying off. Now, a lot of customers will be new to the process, particularly in the SME market, and as such, there does need to be consideration for time to get to grips with this. In terms of when you start to engage with suppliers and have a conversation with them, just bear in mind that not everybody's in the same point. However, like you are here today, there are a range of resources that they can look at, and actually to support your suppliers, it might be worth actually engaging them and sending them some of the information. Say, look at this video, look at the source, this is what we've done, and together you can work with valued suppliers to actually improve their carbon accounting and therefore improve the information that you can achieve from them as well. This slide is actually taken from IEMA, and the reason I just wanted to use this slide is because it's a great example of how when you look at different products or services, you can see how the carbon emissions actually make up. And what we find time and time again is the majority of our emissions sit within this scope 3 element, this value chain element, and actually a small part of our carbon footprint is just what we generate ourselves. And this is one of the reasons why net zero was key in pushing this element, because we could no longer just sit with everybody just taking responsibility for what they were doing, because arguably how you're buying, who you're buying from, and what you're doing in terms of your manufacturing, in terms of the materials you bring into it, do have bigger impacts and therefore do need to be taken into account as well. Now, what's really important to consider is that this is a journey and a process. It is going to take time. No one has the information right now. And what's really lacking in the industry is actually the scope 3 data. And this is something that's really being cried out for and pushed for in a lot of circumstances. How do we start to gather supplier information and scope 3 information in a way that then becomes meaningful for organizations? So the reason I have the slide here is just to sort of demonstrate that actually when you're starting out in this process, for most organizations, we're going to start looking at ourselves, scope 1 and 2, and that's really the good place to start because your scope 1 and 2 is someone else's scope 3 emissions. So having a good understanding of what you are doing can support your customers and your clients and your suppliers in terms of any information that they need. Now, as we go through this process and you start to look at your value chain, you'll find that actually how much you're able to account for will be so much. And then as data becomes more accurate and as information evolves over time, this element will become more and more refined and we'll have a better understanding in terms of how much carbon sits within our value chain. And this is another reason why it's important to start sooner rather than later, because it is going to take time, and therefore the earlier we start it, the more sort of, I guess, availability we have in terms of working within our value chains. Okay, so in terms of what are scope 3 emission sources, so the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, or GHG Protocol, is essentially sets the guidance for process and carbon accounting, otherwise the methodology. They've come up with these 15 categories of emissions, which have 8 upstream and 7 downstream. So upstream emissions, as we saw on the initial slide, is all of everything, essentially all the products and services we're buying into your organization to deliver your service or product. Now, when we look at this, it's by far the easiest to account for and as part of the process. So what we're looking to do is to think about your business operation and activity, looking at your upstream activities using the first 8 of these 15 classifications. What we want to do within the exercise is determine which of these categories are most relevant to our operation. And we want to sort of almost build up a map to identify, okay, well, we buy this, we're not doing this, we buy this, we have access to this, and sort of build up a sort of understanding as to which of these are most relevant to us or most significant for us, which of these can we ignore because generally we don't do them. For example, if you're not a landlord, therefore upstream leased assets won't be something for you to consider. And then also to consider which of these do we actually have most of our procurement spend in. And then within that, then we want to think about which suppliers we work with. Now, obviously, large organizations might have quite a complex supplier database. Small organizations, hopefully a fairly simpler one with maybe a handful of suppliers that they just need to identify. So that's the upstream. We've got purchased goods and services, capital goods, fuel and energy related activities, upstream transportation distribution, waste generators, essentially waste, business travel. So that's any grey fleet or public transport for business needs, employee commuting, and upstream leased assets, which effectively is you as a landlord leasing a building to someone. So repeat the exercise for downstream activities. However, one thing to note within this is downstream activities are far more complex and data gathering will be relatively more difficult. There is also a consideration as to whether you produce products or deliver services, as downstream service impacts are probably going to be a little bit more problematic as not all services have significant carbon impacts. And also some of these categories just don't apply to a service delivery. Now, the initial stage is just to develop a map of which of these categories are most relevant to your organization. And then the next step is to consider which are most important and therefore require initial attention. So as I say throughout the process, we're not going to be able to tackle everything at once. You're not going to be able to tackle all 15 of these, or even if 8 of them are relevant to you, all 8 of them in one go. So what we want to do essentially is to identify which of these are material or have the greatest sort of impact for us and ones that we need to prioritize in the initial starting of this process. And then as we develop over time, as we saw in the initial graphs with the year 1, year 3, and year 15, we just want to improve the information, improve the suppliers we're working with, and just to sort of get more information as we go through time and we have a better understanding of the handle of things. And sorry, just to apologize, upstream leased assets is you are the leasee and downstream is actually you are the landlord. So in our downstream ones, we have transportation distribution. So for anybody who manufactures products but uses the logistics company to transport that on your behalf to your customers. Processing of sold products. So if you produce, a part of a machine and that part goes into another manufacturer who produces then a final product, it's accounting for the emissions of that. You've got use of sold products, end of life of sold products, downstream leased assets, franchises, and investments. And investments is the interesting one at the moment because it's really sort of understanding who you bank with, who you finance with, who your pensions are invested in, and what their investments are actually funding and supporting. So, if they're invested in fossil fuels, it's whether it's actually worth switching investments to something that isn't, invested into a carbon generating activity as well. So again, just going over, so we've looked at the 15 categories, and this is what we're talking about here. So what we want to do initially is what we refer to as mapping our value chain. So we look at the 15 categories and we work out which of those are most applicable to yourself, what activities are included within each of those categories. So what are we actually buying, mapping out or listing those products or services sold, and then listing the suppliers and other relevant partners. And then from that map, you want to think about which of those are your priority and which of those suppliers you want to sort of tackle first in terms of contacting or engaging in information. Now, sorry, just one thing to say is this isn't necessarily a complicated process, but this is really where a lot of the time will be spent, this sort of initial scoping and mapping exercise. And also what's really important to say that it can't just be one person's job. This does need to be a team approach, because you're going to need information from your finance, accounts, and procurement teams to understand spend and category. You're also going to need support in terms of why are you buying these particular products, what are they doing, and how are they being used within the organization. So it really should be something that you as an organization come together and actually look at. So it's not just one person left with this task. It is a sort of a team approach, and that allows you to sort of separate out the tasks a little better and make it a bit of an easier process. But just again, to be really honest and say this is going to take time. It's not necessarily complicated, it's just quite time consuming. So just bear in mind that you're going to need to put that resource into this exercise to do it correctly. So one of the questions you always get asked is, well, how do we actually assess size? So for most organizations starting to do this, you want to consider the impacts of your purchase. So how much are we actually spending, which is a great thing to do, because, you know, in the day, if it's something's costing you a lot of money, it's definitely worth investigating as to ways that you can reduce those costs. But spending lots of money on something doesn't necessarily translate to carbon impacts, because you could spend a lot on something on a low carbon product or spend a very small amount on a high carbon product. So it's also just thinking about, well, really what we want to assess is the carbon impacts of that spend. So we do need to account for money, but most importantly, we want to account for the carbon impacts. But right now, we're trying to exercise which suppliers do we contact. So how do we actually get that data without it? So there are a variety of data sets that you can use, and what they effectively look at is they look at average carbon emissions in sectors where you're spending money. So it's a very, very broad brush. It's extremely averaged and estimated. However, it's a starting point, and that's all the exercise is for. So there's two here. There's the SME Climate Hub, which does provide a sort of good Scope 3 element. You just put in different categories and how much you're spending, and it will give you an idea of how much carbon is related to that. And the NatWest Carbon Planner is a fairly useful tool. If you're looking for a carbon management tool, this is one that I've tried. You can actually link it to your accounting platforms if you use Sage, or I think there's a couple other ones on there. It can actually link to your procurement platform and do the exercise for you, actually pull your spend data in for you. So these are sort of the easier options. However, if anybody's interested in doing it themselves and actually looking at the sort of the background to it, the UK government does produce, the Office for National Statistics produces these greenhouse gas emissions intensities by industry. Effectively, you look at different SIC codes, find where you're spending your money, and then multiply your spend by the factor they give you, kind of like carbon converting, but using money rather than data and this metric that they provide for you. And that will give you the amount of carbon estimated associated to the type of spend that you do. This is something we'll address more within the workshops. I'm just highlighting a way to start to assess size, and certainly have a look at the first two calculators, online calculators, if this is something you just want to have a go at yourself. But say there's something we'll focus on in the workshop in more detail to help you sort of look at this appropriately. Okay, so we've gone through the mapping process. We've looked at the suppliers that we want to essentially identify. We've multiplied that. And we've got our carbon factors. Now what we want to think about, okay, well, who are we going to prioritize and what are we going to do? So what we really want to think about then is how are we going to assess who we want to actually approach? Now, this is taken from the GHG protocol. They have a Scope 3 standard. So again, there's lots of support that they can provide for you. And also the Science Based Target Initiative, they have a supplier engagement guide, which uses the same metric in terms of identifying which suppliers are your priority. Now, there's a number of things you can consider. So first of all, size. So actually, you know, how big is the carbon impact? And that arguably would be one of the sort of the key leading factors. But you might also want to consider influence. So if you have got a real good opportunity to work with and influence your supplier, then, or even if you are a supplier and to a customer and you have a good relationship with them, you know, real good opportunity to potentially work with them and see what support they can give you to help, you know, benefit them. You might also want to consider risks. There might be, supply chain risks. There might be sort of reputational risks or sector requirements to look at a particular supplier or supply chains. That might be something you want to consider. You may have different stakeholders who are interested in particular elements. You also want to think about outsourcing as well. So actually, if you're moving if you're outsourced your work, obviously you don't just want to exclude that. You might want to consider the franchising element type thing. There might be sector guidance, or there might be other reason which you deem. So effectively what you do is you look at which of these are most important to you, and then whichever that you rank your suppliers according to these, and that will help you to identify which suppliers you want to engage with in the first term. So this is just an example. Again, it is taken from IEMA, but I think it's a great example, a visual example of a way to sort of score and look at. One thing to sort of take from this is that, what we also want to do is, if it's a high carbon impact, but you're only buying it once, yes, okay, it's high carbon, but it's likely not to happen again for another 7-8 years, and that might be something you can worry about and push later down the line. What we're really looking for is continuous spend. So who are you actually spending the most time with in terms of that supplier, and spending the most money with, and then obviously securing that in terms of which of those has the highest impact, or which of those rates highest in whichever of those categories you've chosen, and then those are the suppliers that you want to engage with in the first instance. So as I said, the data that we're using is estimated, and what we want to do is we want to refine that information, and that's why we have the supplier engagement process, is because the spend data is too average. We need to get a bit more specific information, and so we go to our suppliers that we want to prioritize, and then engage with them to see what carbon information we can get from them to start to make our process more accurate. So in terms of a strategy to go over, and again, we'll spend a bit more time on this in the workshop, but just to sort of go over the basis of it. Again, just to reiterate, we appreciate supply chains are complex, and that will come down to the type of organization that you are. But there is obviously flexibility in the approach based on spend or carbon. So ideally, carbon is the ideal one, but we also have to think about how much you're spending with them, how long is the relationship with them. So there's lots of things we need to take into account. So we identify our suppliers. We then want to choose our approach. So how are we going to approach working with that supplier? Do we want to be engaging? Do we want to set competition? Do we want to actually set it so that we start to weigh sustainability or carbon data over price, or actually start to increase the weighting we have whenever we go out to tender for different projects or different projects? What kind of communication strategy are we going to use? Are we going to just use our procurement strategy? Are we going to have a bit more of a one-to-one relationship with them? So what does that look like? How are we going to collaborate and support them? So sometimes if we have valued customers or suppliers that we don't want to necessarily lose, how can we work with them in terms of helping them to think about how they can improve their carbon reporting, or even just actually start to undertake their carbon reporting to give you information? What kind of monitoring are you going to have? What kind of time period are you going to look at monitoring? Is it going to be an annual, every other year? Is it every 3 years, 5 years? What's that going to look like as well? And then how are we going to reinforce? Now, there's a link here to an engagement guide. It is on the other one as well, but this one particularly, they've got a supplier section, and they cover this sort of list of categories really well in terms of ideas of how you can communicate, what kind of questions you can ask, and how you could potentially reinforce. And reinforces more around, is there opportunity for you to sort of promote your supplier, if they're really good in terms of their carbon information to other companies that you know of, or colleagues that you work with? And is there a way to sort of, if they can recognize that by giving you information, in the way that you like it, that you can then essentially help create more business for them, then that helps to encourage the suppliers to be more proactive in continuing to measure and provide your carbon data. So this is just an example. Again, it is taken from IEMA, but just again, the reason I like it is because it sort of shows the opportunities you have. So supplier engagement is one tool that you could potentially look to have and utilize, but also to bear in mind that it might not be the only method of decarbonizing a particular supply chain. So if we're looking at procurement of goods and services, so the first category, this is just a sort of an option. And generally speaking, this would be likely to be similar for most, although some might have slightly different options available to you. But if you're buying in a product, and that product has got a high carbon emissions to it, could you potentially shift to an alternative product that has a lower carbon emission associated to it? So can you change the materials or products that you're working with? If, for example, it's not necessarily the product, but actually the supplier you're working with, and they're a high carbon supplier, and are not likely to engage or not likely to look to shift in the way that you're looking into, then might be actually, well, let's see if we can find another supplier who does the same thing, but actually has a better carbon management. And then really the supply engagement is just, like I say, it's sometimes not always feasible, or you might just have a really valued person that you've been working with for many years, and you'd like to encourage them to, come along with you on this journey. And that's really where the supply engagement comes in play. So there are a range of options. And like I said, there's no silver bullet, there's no one strategy, no one method to all of this. It's really thinking about what it is that we're buying, how is that relevant to our organization, and then what are the opportunities for us, of which engagement is one of them. It's just for a lot of organizations, it's probably going to be the biggest part of this process, which is why we sort of focus on it mostly when we're talking about looking at our value chains. So Scope 3 accounting does have the potential to lead down a quite scary rabbit hole, and most importantly, without standardized guidance, it's kind of harder to ascertain what kind of level of supply you need to engage with. By level, we mean sort of what tiering suppliers do we need to engage with. For now, however, the working hypothesis is to work with your immediate tier 1 suppliers. Now, look, this may change in time as standardization comes in play, although I'm sure for most SMEs it's likely just to stay your sort of tier 1 approach, but it's a good place to start without making the process even more complicated. Saying that, large organizations or manufacturers who produce high carbon materials may still need to look further down their value chain to identify ways to reduce value chain emissions, because it might not be your immediate supplier, but the materials that they're buying that have the high carbon value, and that might be something you want to address. So we see this particularly with extremely large companies. They do start to look actually tier 2, tier 3, even sometimes tier 4 in terms of their supply chain to work out where there's opportunities to improve carbon emissions throughout, particularly those within the manufacturing sector. So for most businesses, you're just working with your immediate suppliers. That's the best way to deal with it. Should that change, obviously information will come out and we'll sort of help to work with you at the time to improve that sort of knowledge around that element. Okay, so what to consider when engaging. Now, it's key to understand your suppliers and the information you're likely to get from them. So larger suppliers are more likely to have data, hopefully, while small independents are likely to probably just be starting out in this journey. Not always the case, and we work with lots of small organizations who are already carbon accounting, and it's fantastic. But just to be aware that the size of your organization or the supplier that you're working with may dictate what opportunity there is to get information from them. So just bearing that in mind. You might also want to consider location of the business. So particularly when it comes to logistics elements. So if they're international, there's going to be a lot of carbon emissions associated with actually the transport of the material to your organization. And again, it's something to think about. Can we switch to something that's more local or actually has a good national setup that can allow us to get products without lots of carbon going into the transportation of those goods? Now, really, one of the most important aspects when thinking about engagement is the relationship you have with that supplier. As that may provide an opportunity to engage with them. If they're a valued supplier and you've been working with them for quite some time, or you just have a really good relationship with them. And again, I said, if you are a client, so if you're actually a supplier to a client, again, same process, engage with them, find out what information they want and what they can possibly do to support you, because there might be opportunities for them to sort of help you to refine what it is what they're looking for, and that could in turn help to identify what you want to get from your suppliers as well. So it's worth having that conversation on both ends, upstream and downstream, to understand what data needs to be gathered. So in terms of what information that we want, so it's also important to think about what kind of information are we actually looking to get from them. There's one thing just to engage with them, but actually what are we asking them for? Now, one thing I just wanted to highlight within this is that net zero is the driver, but it's not the only opportunity. So we can also use this process to consider impactful products. So some sort of environmental impacts will have carbon implications, but they have wider sustainability impacts as well. So thinking about, are the materials one-off, are they single-use plastics, that kind of thing. So it has a huge sort of environmental aspect to it. So by actually working with your suppliers to improve packaging, because you're already talking to them about carbon emissions, you can sort of tackle two birds with one stone. Now, it's important to start your dialogues with your suppliers with the aim of helping them to green their business or to help them become more sustainable. So you could discuss how they could use packaging, maybe look at how they're delivering products and that kind of thing. Now, some might be receptive, some might not be. So again, it's also then once you've started that process and you found that actually the guys you're working with are great and happy to oblige and actually work with you, fantastic. good to work with. But if you find over time that they're just not willing to engage, you might need to consider as an opportunity for us to switch to someone who's able to join us on this journey. What's really important in this context is to let them know why you want this information, how this information is going to help you, but also how it's going to benefit them as well. You can't just turn around and say, we want this, end of. It needs to be that kind of engagement, that dialogue. As I said, it is a process. It will take time. They'll need to start to get handle on developing their carbon reduction. Like yourselves who've started this journey or on this journey, they need to sort of do the same thing. And you can all appreciate how much time it's taken you to get to where you are. So we also have to accept that it's going to take them similar times to do the same thing as well. What's also really important to note is that data is essentially important and we need it because that's the whole reason we're engaging, but it does need to come with an improvement plan, especially if you're looking at net zero. So if you have a net zero target and you have to therefore reduce your scope 3 targets, ideally your suppliers need to have similar aspects. Now, they might not necessarily need to have a target ambition, but they should really be thinking about how they're going to decarbonize and how they're going to reduce their carbon targets in order to support your journey towards net zero as well. So again, that's something to consider. That will change in time. It might just be, do you have carbon first, and then start to, after a couple of years saying, okay, well, what are you doing to reduce that? What kind of targets do you have? And again, signposting them to support to help them improve their own performance as well. Okay. So as I said before, it is something that's going to improve over time. Completeness of the inventory is important. So as discussed, data is important, but under the decarbonisation webinar, so again, something to look at if you're looking at decarbonisation, there are 5 carbon accounting principles, of which completeness is one of them. So actually having a complete, well-rounded carbon footprint. And in order to be complete, we sometimes might need to forgo accuracy. So particularly when we're looking at scope 3, as I mentioned before, the first bit that we look at in terms of our scoping and understanding where our impacts are is to look at spend base, but that's very estimated data. What we want to do within time is to make that data more accurate, therefore allowing us to make more informed decisions because we can then track changes over time. So what we effectively want to get is from our spend-based data to work through supplier engagement or through information and eventually get to a point where actually the data we're able to access is real-time live data that shows any improvements that are made on an annual basis or over a period of time. So ideally we want to get to the supplier specific, sorry, really difficult to say, supplier specific data in the end of it as well. And this slide just shows the progress of how the data will ideally and hopefully eventually be made available to us. And again, this is something we see a lot of being spoken about at the moment is how can we build data sets that allows this data to be more easily accessible to organizations in a way to actually account for their scope 3 in a far simpler method than always having to rely on people to provide us with data. So one of the key things as well is when we're starting this conversation, we also just need to consider what refers to as allocation. So a simply put process is if we speak to our supplier and say, have you got carbon information? They say, yes, I can give you my scope 1 and 2. Here we go. Here's 50 tons of carbon that we're emitting. You're only one person working with that organization. You're not responsible for those 50 tons. So what we do need to do is to actually ascertain how much of their total carbon footprint is relevant to yourself. Now, going back to the previous slide, when we look at supply-specific information, what would be amazing is if we can actually get a carbon value per service or per product. So if they can tell you it's 1 ton per product you buy from us and you buy 10 products, you know that you're 10 tons. So that's the ideal. However, in between that, we're not going to be able to necessarily have that level of data. That's something that will take time to develop. But certainly in those instances, then we need to work out a way of how we can actually allocate the emissions to us. I'm not going to spend too much time on this today, and just to say that this is a process that needs to be done once you start getting data from your suppliers. And this is part of the conversation you need to have is in terms of how much you're going to allocate from them. This slide is here to give you sort of, again, it's taken from the GHG protocol, the scope 3 element, and gives you a list of options of how you could potentially work out, roughly speaking, what kind of carbon you want to take from your suppliers or how much they want to give you effectively as your supplier as well. So as part of the information, obviously, we want to understand the carbon information. If we can get it per product or per service delivered, fantastic. If not, then we just need to work out how we can allocate. The market value is the simplest one. It basically, essentially, if they're 50 tons of carbon and you're 5% of their turnover, you just take 5% of that 50 tons. So that can be an easy way of doing it, but it might be that you might look at sort of mass of their total products and you just account for it that way, depends on the organization. But just being aware that that also needs to become part of the dialogue and conversation. How much of their emissions are you responsible for? Because you don't want to account for the whole 50 tons and every supplier accounts at 50 tons, or else we are then going to be double counting. That will just throw out the whole exercise as well. Okay, so that's just the sort of the background. That's just getting started. One of the key drivers in terms of actually starting this process, and particularly with engagement, is to start to look at our procurement policy. Now, sustainable procurement is an opportunity for organizations to better understand their supply chains, as well as being an opportunity to collaborate. And large organizations have been instrumental in driving better sustainability performance within their supply chains. And also within the public sector, we've seen the introduction of the PPN 0621, which I've talked about previously, and we'll talk about in a bit more detail later on. However, a good procurement policy and a good procurement strategy can really help you to identify where the opportunities are and how to start to engage with your suppliers as well. So when we're looking at procurement, like I said, we're looking at the process that we've gone through. The first thing we want to think about is actually, do we still need to buy this product or service? Can we potentially look at what we're doing? Can we maybe look at, changing a little bit of what we're doing so that we don't have this really high carbon, really expensive product and we shift it for something else? So can we change our processes to minimize carbon and actually eliminate this as a procurement challenge? The second thing to think about, is there another way to buy this product? So do we actually have to buy it? Could we rent it? Could we lease it? Could we loan it? Could we get someone else to look at it? And is there something else we can do in terms of how we actually manage this type of product, or is there another way of actually doing this? And then finally, we also want to think about what happens at the end of it. So are we buying something to essentially throw it away, or how much waste is it generating? And actually, do we need to think about repairable products, remanufactured products, recyclable products? Is that something we have in play, and how are we starting to look at it? So when we first start to look at procurement, it's really just to understand actually what are we buying, why are we buying it, how is that then turning into waste, and is there any way in that entire process we can change it to reduce carbon, but also to improve our procurement processes? And then we can start to look at what strategy we put around it in terms of how we're going to move going forward as well. So obviously, procurement can be a complex area, and it really does need to be looked at as a risk-based approach. And again, as I said, not everything can be tackled all at once. So we do want to think about where are the big areas. So when we start to look at procurement activity, obviously we want to think about our areas of spend, as we've spoken about. We also want to think about which of those procurement categories represent risks. So is there a risk within our supply chain? Is climate change going to actually impact some of their suppliers? Now, we've seen a lot over the last few years in terms of particularly those in the food industry, with sort of security concerns around certain food products and that sort of thing. So we also want to start to think about, are any of the products we're buying in, are there climate risks associated to this? What are we going to need to think about in 5 years' time? Do global economics have an impact? Are the wars likely to affect our suppliers and our supply chain, and how are we going to sort of look at security going forwards? So there's lots of things that we can do within this exercise. But again, when thinking about it, it's just really to identify how are we going to manage what we're purchasing, and in order to ensure as an organization we can continue to go. And I also want to think about, is there anything we're buying in, or in fact, when we're choosing what we buy in, are we choosing products and services that are actually improving what we do? So are we buying the highest energy rated materials, etc.? So I'm not going to get into too much detail on this, but effectively knowing what you're doing in terms of procurement, and then thinking about how that's governed. So who's responsible for your purchasing? Do you have a team? Is there a department? Can anybody buy whatever they want? Is there any sort of guidance in terms of what they should be buying? So we talk about whether it's a sort of centralized approach or a decentralized approach to purchasing. And actually, does everybody know what they should be buying? Do they know what a sustainability choice looks like? Do they even know what sustainable products are? Is there a list of suppliers they should be working with? That kind of thing. So really thinking about, what are you buying in? How is that currently being managed? And are there improvements that we can make to it, including behavioral change and working with our teams? And then actually how we're communicating that and engaging with those teams to ensure that everybody understands what's going on. Now, the policy itself, obviously wants to set out the principles and guidance in terms of product selection. So effectively, the policy should help anybody who's purchasing something to understand what they should consider when they are choosing something. And there's different things. If it's a one-off product, there might be a slightly different strategy to maybe something that needs to be tendered, or you're going to a list of suppliers in terms of, a larger spend that you're going to do as well. What's really important in procurement policy is also to think about it is a process will need to be reviewed in line with all your other policies, and something that will need to adapt and change with time. Particularly with the supplier engagement element, you might start within procurement to consider maybe sustainability as 10% of your weighting when you're tendering, and then within the next 5 years, 40% of your tendering is going to be based on sustainability, particularly carbon measurements and carbon targets. So again, it's also thinking about how this procurement policy is going to support your net zero ambitions, and particularly within your value chain, and how it's going to encourage people to come along on the journey with you. So these slides effectively are taken from a sort of a template of procurement policy. These are sort of standard sentences that you would look to put into it. And then particularly on the last one here, so we will consider the following options as part of its environmental policy and where practical implement changes. And then these might be, when we're looking at types of products that we're going to put, we're obviously looking at ones that are least environmentally harmful, low carbon, locally sourced, reusable, manufactured, etc., low energy, whatever it is. So here you can sort of list what are we going to select when we're looking to make practical changes, when we're looking to choose products, and really start to think about what kind of information, what kind of products are available to you, what can you actually purchase. Now, there might be some that are at the moment unique, therefore there isn't much change. Again, that's perfectly fine. We're always just looking at where the opportunities exist and ensuring that we're maximizing those opportunities as much as we can, and managing the ones that we can't necessarily change initially as well. Just bear in mind that the policy doesn't mean you have to choose these. It's just that's the preferred option. It should always be sought first, but obviously there are other things that we might need to take into account as well. So if it's not possible to purchase a green alternative, then we might need to consider compromising this. And in that case, then we'll ensure that if we do have to pick a slightly, shall we say, a higher impact product, we're just going to make sure that we are reviewing that policy, we're checking with that supplier, we're looking at other alternatives on a sort of frequent basis, and always looking to try to improve that. Managing what we have to for now and trying to improve it with time as well. And then again, consider the following checklist wherever practicable with regards to resource use, recycling, etc., etc., etc. So thinking about the type of products we're using, again, can they be recycled? Is there hazardous content in it? How much energy does it consume? How much packaging does it come with? What's this transportation like? And are there any elements within this we can start to improve upon? And actually, can we start to engage with our suppliers to try and improve that? So, for example, if you're looking at energy, how much does it use? Is there a better alternative? And that sort of thing as well. So, there's lots to sort of think about within the procurement policy, and what we want to do essentially is to look at these options. Now, as part of the workshop, we will provide you with a procurement policy template that you can go through and look at, and we'll have a bit of a deeper conversation around setting a procurement policy that you can use going forwards, and the sort of things that you might want to consider relevant to you as an organization as well. Okay, just conscious of time, last few slides. So I just wanted to go over now. There's lots of organizations we've started to work with who are effectively approaching us to develop carbon reduction plans because they are now part of public sector supply chains, and therefore have to provide a carbon reduction plan under PPN 0621. So we saw a huge change over the last year with organizations effectively falling into this, and therefore having to being required by public sector, particularly the NHS now as well, that they have to produce a carbon reduction plan. So this is just information around it, the sort of the history to it, how it's come about, and particularly when it started, effectively 2021, hence the name. And what's important at the moment is it's really for contracts valued above 5 million, but there is already conversation about whether that will change and what that will change to, in terms of actually that might be reduced as a tender contract. But again, it's still only been spoken about in the moment. However, one of the key things to this process, and one reason I wanted to bring it up, is because under PPN 0621 is there is a drive for a carbon reduction plan. Now, for most organizations, and this is really looking at you as a customer, and sorry, you as a supplier to a client, what kind of information might you want to be putting out there or being made available for someone should they ever come to you and say, we now need your carbon information? And actually, the process you go through under this, under the PPN 0621, is a great framework and guidance for any organization who's thinking about, well, what do I actually want to talk about? What kind of information do I want to put out there? Now, the key thing in this is under the guidance of PPN 0621, there is a template, and we'll go into it in just a second, which will give you a sort of structure in terms of the information you want to talk about. It helps you to look at it. It essentially asks for scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and includes a list of sources that you might want to think about in terms of what are you reporting under your scope 3. So it might be commuting, business travel, maybe some procurement, that kind of thing. What's really important under the carbon reduction plan is that it helps you to set where you are currently. So you set your baseline, and then you set where you are currently. And every year you update your carbon reduction plan in terms of your performance. So every year you're updated, and that's always compared against your baseline. Now, under PPN 0621, you have to commit to net zero. The latest is 2050. I think the earliest is 2040, roughly. And you have to have a net zero commitment under that. Now, if you're reporting carbon reduction to a customer, you don't necessarily need to have a net zero. That's obviously a conversation to have with them. If they insist one have, then fine, 2050, 2040, depending on what you think is more realistic. But what's most important with this is that it's an annual document that has to be publicly made available, shown on your website, so anybody can look at it and actually see how you're performing on an annual basis, which again is a great method to follow, because it means anybody who might be a potential customer of yours can actually see what you're doing around carbon emissions, and therefore become a more attractive supplier for them to work with as well. So here is the link to the template. I will just very quickly just go into it. Won't take a second. This is the link to the template. It's freely available, and it's there for anybody to use. Yes, I appreciate this is set up for the government, but just to show you this bit, which is why I think it's quite an important template to look at, is this is a great way in terms of actually how you set out your sort of carbon accounting. Do you have a commitment to net zero? What is your baseline emissions? And then just information in terms of what's the methodology you followed? How did you calculate this information? And what is this essentially based upon? And then opportunity to put in your scope details. And then every year you update this with where you are currently. So at the end of your year, you complete your carbon footprint, and you just update this section along with information into it. And the key thing here is that you have to talk about what your targets are, what opportunities you have, and really important is actually what are you doing to achieve your carbon reductions going forward as well. So as you can see here, it's a great way of actually demonstrating yourself as a potential client for other customers. Showing that you're looking at your carbon emissions, you've got targets, you've got action plans, and you're demonstrating performance towards achieving those targets. And again, a great way of actually demonstrating what you're doing as an organization, so that should you wish to work with other customers, or other people might be looking for different suppliers, it's there available for them to look at and say, yeah, great, I see what they're doing, let's have a conversation with them. So a great sort of tool to use. And like I say, for those who are considering what to actually put in terms of promoting your carbon emissions, this is a lovely template to use on that basis as well. Okay. Last few points, there's just sort of things to consider. And one of the reasons I also wanted to mention this as well is because we're likely to start to see carbon reporting become sort of mainstream. There's already talk about climate risk reporting from the government. We're starting to see things like ESOS, the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme, starting to be questioned about being pushed through the larger of the SMEs. And we're already starting to see conversations in EU and the UK around sort of carbon management on goods being imported and exported as well. So what we're seeing definitely is conversation around the regulations to this, that more and more onus we put on organizations to start to report their carbon emissions. So by actually using this template or a similar sort of process to reporting your carbon emissions will help to protect you against changes that you're already ahead of the game as well. So again, one of the reasons why we're really talking about this, and a reason to get started, is because it will help to protect you for any changes that might come in the future. And for those who do have to report under PPN 0621, these are the scope 3 emissions that you need to report, that you need to include within your reporting. So scope 1, scope 2, and then you have to include carbon related to waste, business travel, and commuting, probably the easiest of the three. Upstream transportation and downstream transportation, so any logistics involved in buying in goods and services, and anything you sell in terms of the transportation of that as well. Just for interest, what I effectively mean by that is the scope 1 and 2, essentially scope 1 related to upstream transportation, unless you use electric vehicles, and downstream as well. So it might be then actually, if you're a supplier within PPN 0621, you need to speak to your companies who are essentially transporting goods to find that information. So this might require a bit of that supplier engagement. as well. Just in terms of those who aren't necessarily doing PPN but are looking to use the carbon templates, just when it talks about scope 3, this is where we spoke about all everything we spoke about today. It's working out what you feel is most significant for you, always looking at the easier to go for options, waste, travel, water, that kind of thing, and start to report that within your reporting going forwards. Okay, so just a quick summary over what we've spoken about today. Obviously, when we're thinking about scope 3, always bear in mind that it's a measure of your influence that you have as an organization, and ultimately your choices, your communication, and everything you do has the potential to improve your carbon footprint for other organizations, which which in turn improves your own value chain. Also, bear in mind that if you are a supplier to a customer, anything that you do helps to support them as well, and again can help you to look more attractive as an organization for other customers who might want to work with your particular product or buy your particular product off you as well. Whenever we start this process, start to focus on the easy ones initially, but as I said, one of the key things we do, and it is going to take time, is to start to look at your resource mapping to understand which parts of your procurement process you're going to tackle first, and which of those suppliers you're going to start your engagement with. And there's a whole list of things that we do, and we'll talk about this more in the actual workshops themselves. Upstream will by far be the easiest process. Downstream might be a little bit more complicated, but again, it depends on your customers and who you're working with and what kind of information you might be able to get back from them in terms of your own reporting as well. If you are a service delivery, the downstream will look slightly different. There might actually be quite a lot of the downstream that isn't relevant to yourself, and so in that case, it's just the upstream you want to focus on. But for all organizations, I would say that's the easiest one to go for, so that's where I would spend most of your time for now. And obviously, we're waiting for any sort of standardization of net zero to come out, which may change the conversation of what we need to do, and obviously that will be updated as we go forwards. And always just remember that, when you're working with your customers or your suppliers, that, everybody's at a different part in their carbon journey. And so if you can support them, send them links, send them information. There's a whole range of information out there, freely available resources, toolkits and videos and webinars and everything around the supply chain issue. So there's lots of information out there to support them. And again, you can even maybe show them these sort of presentations or encourage them to come along to the workshops that we are doing as well.